Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. The UK Independence Party's vote gains in last month's local and European elections dealt a blow to the more established political parties in Britain and highlighted fears of a possible drift to the right across the political spectrum. This was despite the Conservative Party introducing caps on immigration from outside the European Union and promising a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. The Conservatives also denounced multiculturalism as a threat to society and focused on the Muslim community for its alleged failings. A prominent survey that was reported across the news media indicated that a considerable number of British people believe Muslims pose a serious threat to democracy and that Islam is incompatible with the British way of life. Worryingly, 45% of British people also think there are too many Muslims in the country. And recently, a far-right organisation calling itself Britain First, which describes itself as a street defence organisation and is staffed with ex-members of the British National Party, has conducted what it calls Christian patrols in Muslim areas and even entered mosques in some cities and towns. And so, with Islamophobia rising, especially in the media, and exemplified in cases such as the Trojan Horse episode, where an alleged Islamic plot to take over schools in Birmingham dominated headlines recently, we ask today whether the rise of the far right in the UK and Europe will have an effect on policy. Can we expect continued increases in voting for far-right parties? Joining me to discuss this are Dr. Gavin Bailey, a sociologist and postdoctoral research associate at the University of Leicester, Joseph Mulhall, a postgraduate research student at Royal Holloway College, and on the line we have Mohammed Amin, who is Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum. Welcome to you all. But before we start the discussion, let's have a look at this report.
In scenes that echo the 1930s, the Britain First Party's Christian patrol marches through Brick Lane in Tower Hamlets. This patrol, through a predominantly Muslim area, was supposedly about maintaining law and order and opposing radical extremism. Critics, meanwhile, call their actions racist and Islamophobic and accuse them of stirring up racial tension. These street tactics are reminiscent of those used 80 years ago by Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. With Brick Lane, the current scene of far-right operations, not too far from the location of the 1936 Battle of Cable Street, where Mosley's fascists and anti-fascist groups clashed as they tried to march down the then mainly Jewish area of London's East End. The Britain First Party was formed 3 years ago as a splinter group from the BNP. In recent months, it has gained media attention through its provocative street patrols, military imagery, and invasions of various mosques around the country. It has also attracted controversy through its Facebook page, where it has appropriated images relating to the military and nationalism. In June, a post calling for remembrance of D-Day veterans went viral, prompting many commentators to raise concerns that people did not understand Britain First's far-right policies.
One look at Britain First's posts shows that their vision of Britain is very different. Their wall is filled with negative posts about halal meat and calls to bring back hanging. They perpetuate the myth that there is an ever more threatening minority, demanding special rights from a cowed and pandering nation emasculated by health and safety gone mad and multicultural Britain.
But arguably, the real risk that these parties pose isn't their potential to gain electoral support or incite violence, but their ability to force mainstream politicians to adopt parts of their rhetoric against issues like immigration and Islamic extremism. Speaking to Channel 4 News last week, former BNP fundraiser and founder of Britain First, Jim Dowson, explained how he felt far-right parties could effect change in this way.
If you apply professional marketing and fundraising to a political situation, it's a gift. And that's what we did with the BNP, raising them £4 million and then leaving them to it, just to make them successful enough to push everybody over to the right. And I think that has resulted now in the success that UKIP is enjoying. Everybody's over to the right a couple of notches.
This strategy may arguably have already worked. 3 years ago, following the steady implosion of the BNP, David Cameron gave a speech which coincided with a march by the English Defence League on the failings of multiculturalism, where he stated that not enough was being done to root out radical extremism in minority communities.
Under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream. We've even tolerated these segregated communities behaving in ways that run completely counter to our values. So when a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't white, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful, to stand up to them.
Critics claim that such statements would only fuel attacks by the far right on Muslims and further isolate the Muslim community from public life. The question moving forwards is whether future governments of all colours will reject the rhetoric of the far right or adopt it. Nathaniel Amos Sanson, Islam Channel.
Well, Gavin Bailey, let me start with you. We saw the Britain First leader there saying that he's managed to push the entire political debate a little bit to the right, several notches, I think he said. Do you think he's correct on that?
I'm not sure. I mean, one of the questions would be what would happen with a counterfactual? What would have happened if the far right hadn't been mobilised? Because a lot of this is to do with public opinion, to do with the newspaper coverage of issues such as multiculturalism, Islam, immigration in particular. And so it's entirely possible that the mainstream parties would have moved to the right, even if those groups hadn't been successful, just because they feel like they need to respond to public opinion, or possibly what they perceive as public opinion, because that's what the newspapers are telling them. I read recently that it's sort of the Daily Mail says something, and the mainstream parties jump to it.
Joseph Mulhall, I mean, what's the origin of these far-right parties? Why do they have any traction?
Well, I guess I'd perhaps challenge the fact that they do have traction. I think what we have to do is we have to separate the perception of the scale and threat of the far right from the reality of it. Often we hear about the rise of the far right. Now, if you look at the far right in Britain at the moment, it's in disarray. It's splintering, it's cracking. From the peak of the British National Party in 2010, when they had perhaps as many as 12,000 members, it's now down well below 3,000, perhaps less than 1,500. I mean, Britain First at a peak has perhaps 1,500 activists, and the EDL, even though it had 50,000 Facebook members, actual activists, again, it was probably less than 3,000. So what we have to do is separate the perception of the scale of this threat from the reality of it, because what the perception is doing is it is leading into, I do believe, the centrist parties and the populist parties shifting right on some of this rhetoric because of the perceived threat and the size of this issue. Whereas actually I think if we can challenge some of the realities, you know, and put forward the realities of how big the far right actually is in Britain, then what we can do is hopefully put off some of those people in the centre who feel like they need to shift right to appease this mass voice that I'm not actually sure is there.
Well, let's hear from Mohammed Amin. Mohammed, you are on the Conservative Muslim Forum. Do you accept the argument that the whole political debate has been pushed a bit to the right, particularly with the Conservatives moving right as a result of these far-right parties coming out?
I think it's quite wrong to say that the Conservative Party is shifting to the right as a result of the activities of the far right. The Conservative Party has a clear economic policy, it has a clear policy on Europe, and it has a clear policy on how many people are allowed to come to this country, and the fact that we want the people that we actually want to come to this country with skills.
So, no, but I'm not sure whether you're saying that the Conservative Party hasn't moved to the right, or it has moved to the right, but for different reasons other than the existence of these far-right parties.
In my personal view, the Conservative Party is where it's always been. It hasn't shifted to the right, it hasn't shifted to the left.
Well, what about the clip that we saw from David Cameron in the VT, condemning the idea of state multiculturalism? I mean, just last week we had the Trojan horse thing, and one of the things that Ofsted said was that these schools weren't telling kids enough about different cultures in their country. So they were sort of, on the one hand, Cameron is condemning multiculturalism, and Ofsted is saying these schools don't talk about multiculturalism. So there's a complete contradiction, isn't there?
No, there is no contradiction at all. What Cameron was condemning in the Munich speech, and which he had previously condemned in a speech in Birmingham a few years before when he was in opposition, was something called state multiculturalism, where the state sets out to treat different groups of people differently rather than treating us all as equal citizens treated in the same way. And I think it was an excellent speech that he made in Munich. Most of the people who are against the speech haven't really read it or understood it properly. And as far as Trojan horse is concerned, what the Ofsted report, and I've read all 5 Ofsted reports on the schools that are being placed in special measures what these reports found were schools that was either failing completely in educational terms, or where the educational performance was quite reasonable, but the schools had changed in character and were attempting to impose a very conservative religious view on all of their pupils. Remember, most of the parents who were complaining in these schools were Muslim parents. One of the most outspoken people on this issue has been Khalid Mahmood MP, who is a Muslim.
All right, well, Gavin Bailey, let me come back to you. This other element of David Cameron's clip that we saw there, he was claiming that people are sort of frightened of criticising non-white people if they make sort of racist or, you know, sectarian comments of one kind or another. Do you think that's a fair analysis of what's going on?
I'm not sure. I know that when in all of these dynamics, there's always a question. There's always an argument that it's one rule for them and one rule for us. And to take the Trojan horse case as the most recent example, we have a situation where people who are the argument, I think it was David Cameron who made the speech this week, along again saying, well, we wouldn't accept the BNP. We wouldn't say that the Combat 18 are the baddies, but we'd accept the BNP. So in the same way that we're going against violent Islamists, we should also tackle the other Islamists. But at the same time, there have been BNP activists who have been school governors. So you could say that people haven't been against they haven't condemned the far right either at various points. And it's very easy to pick out small examples where, well, today it's not fair for us, and then the other side say a few weeks later, well, today it's not fair for us. It almost contributes to the tit-for-tat nature of this.
I mean, we mentioned the UK Independence Party in the introduction. I mean, would you describe them as a far-right party?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I think they are right-wing. They're certainly. I mean, I think we have to be careful about. I think we do call them fascists. People call them fascists too quickly, and I think we end up watering down and devaluing some of these terms. They are certainly a hard right party, and I would argue that they're probably xenophobic, and they certainly have racists within them, and they certainly have far-right members within them. But they're just, I think, a product of this shift to the right, and I think it's very difficult when he was saying that it's hard to say that the Conservatives haven't moved right on this. I think it's very difficult to argue that the centre ground of politics hasn't shifted right on these issues. I mean, if you look at, before the Munich speech, if you look at the David Cameron speech that he gave, first criticising multiculturalism, I mean, it was on the day of the big EDL demo in Luton, and to say that these things are complete coincidences, that he comes out and criticises the English Defence League, multiculturalism on the day of what was supposed to be their big EDL demo in Luton, I think is very difficult to maintain. And I think if you look, for instance, in 1979 with Margaret Thatcher's Swamp speech, well, that came just as the National Front was standing 303 candidates, and it was about pulling the rug out from underneath the far-right vote. So I think it is difficult to maintain the idea that the centre ground hasn't shifted right on these issues.
Well, what about policy, though? I mean, the question is, you know, politicians often don't do what they say they're going to do, or at least don't follow up on some of the promises they make. The question we wanted to discuss at the beginning of the programme was, is there a shift in policy that you see as opposed to a shift in rhetoric?
I mean, personally, no, there hasn't been a huge amount of policy changes. I mean, there has been lots of rhetoric and lots of discussion about multiculturalism. As yet, I don't think that has strongly manifested itself in firm policies against any of this. I mean, perhaps there's some examples you can think of.
In some ways, though, I mean, thinking about policy is important, but at the same time, all of that rhetoric does drive people into a situation where there becomes an element of mistrust. If there is rhetoric which says there are extremists in schools in Birmingham, there will be people who will believe that. And I mean, I've seen, comments below the line on newspaper articles that seem to be implying that these schools were terrorist training camps, which is obviously a total exaggeration of what's going on. Yet,
but at the same time, I do think it is equally unhelpful to then sometimes the reaction is to say that there is no problem whatsoever. I think you know, even if you just look at the rise of the English Defence League and Britain First are two good examples. Both of them intrinsically linked to the actions of groups like Al-Mujahirun. And now, why these are tiny minority groups, and Islamic extremism is a tiny issue. I think completely ignoring it, I do think, feeds into some of these things, and there is this idea that no one talks about it. But if you look at the reality of it, I mean, they were talking then, it's very rarely out of the newspapers, this. Lots of people, David Cameron says it's acceptable to criticise someone who says it if they're white, but not if they're perhaps Asian or Muslim. Well, I'm not sure that does bear out. It seems to be that's all we talk about is immigration in this country and the Muslim community. It seems to be that's all that's in the newspapers.
Well, Mohammed, I mean, do you accept that criticism of the media, that there's too much talk about immigration and alleged fundamentalism and all the rest of it?
Well, the sad thing is that some parts of the media make a point of selling newspapers on the back of Islamic extremism. Al-Mujahirun is always good for copy for newspapers, for photographs, and some newspapers actually increase their sales that way. Not the newspapers that I read. You don't find the Financial Times behaving that way, but there are other newspapers that do make a point of blowing up people like Al-Mujahirun as a way of selling copy. It's very sad.
But is it not also used by some mainstream politicians as a way of getting votes?
I don't think so.
And I mean, you don't see any shift in your own party's policy as a result of this? I mean, I asked the other guests about the difference in rhetoric and policy. You think the Conservative Party policy is just as it was 3 or 4 years ago, is it, on these issues?
Of course, policy always changes to deal with specific issues and problems. So we've seen, as a result of Trojan Horse, that the Department for Education has tightened up its guidelines. In fact, its funding agreements with schools. So the schools are under a positive obligation now to promote fundamental British values of democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. I'm reading from the new model funding agreement. I think changes like that are entirely appropriate. Well, you have a problem, you deal with it.
Well, use the word British in the thing that you were reading?
Yes, fundamental British values of democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance.
Aren't those values French, German, Italian, general European values, indeed universal values? Why are they British?
Of course. The reality is that to claim them as distinctively British is a bit cheeky, but these are fundamental values that apply in our society, and we should stand up for them.
Yes, but if you use the word British, you're implying that they're unique to Britain when they're not. I mean, isn't that a kind of cultural xenophobia or isolationism or something?
I think it's cheeky, that's all.
I think one of the things about policies such as this is the question is how much are they actually making a difference on the ground and how much are they message policies? Because that particular statement is very, very similar to the kind of statement that is now in the citizenship ceremony. And the citizenship ceremony and the test that is now used for people who want to get indefinite leave to remain, but previously was used at the point at which you gained British citizenship, has similar sorts of issues. It's got there were lots of the test was questions about life in Britain, but when it came to actually going through the ceremony, you would have to then say, I'm going to abide by the rule, and I, effectively believe in those British values. But does that actually make a difference to the people who go through the process? Well, that's another question. But it does send out the message to wider society, we have an issue and we want to deal with it. But then once that message is being sent out to wider society, we have an issue, it's then reinforcing that.
And I think that message is certainly often changed and affected by the perceived threat of the far right. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Gordon Brown was talking about British jobs for British workers, One might, whether or not he was making a reference, I doubt it, but, this was a National Front old slogan, and that perceived threat of this feeling in society. And what ends up happening is I think sometimes we end up confusing legitimate concerns, which we constantly hear in the press at the moment, legitimate concerns about immigration, rather than widespread concerns. I think too often the mainstream parties are willing to just accept this idea and accept the rhetoric around people are worried about immigration without drilling down and saying why. Why not look at other things that are causing these issues, rather than the knee-jerk reaction is to be tough on immigration. I mean, the Labour Party have certainly shifted right with their rhetoric around their immigration, and a lot of this is because of the things like populism in Europe and UKIP.
Well, that's a very good point. Maybe it's the Labour Party that's shifted more than the Conservatives as a result of all this.
I think it's almost like everybody has to follow everybody else. They used to talk of it as outflanking the right, but it's sort of everyone gets dragged together, I guess, because the competition is in a way, who sounds the toughest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the Labour Party are scared on this issue. I mean, you listen to their rhetoric and you listen to what they're talking about, and they'll be very scared in the run-up to the election. And it's all about who can be the toughest on immigration. I mean, there's almost hardly any talking about why is it that people have these fears: jobs, housing, schools. It's none of that. Lots of that's jettisoned in favour of this hard rhetoric on immigration. And the problem is that as you homogenise these parties that all shift to the right on immigration, there's no voice, there's no alternative voice. Everyone comes together, there's no option of hope, there's no option of a progressive alternative. So all of a sudden it becomes that everyone thinks this, and it gets into the psyche that this is a problem. Yeah.
OK, well, on that note, I'm afraid we'll have to end because we've now run out of time for this debate. I'd like to thank my guests for taking part, and of course you for watching. Please join us in the second half when we'll be discussing the court sentencing in Egypt of the Al Jazeera journalists. So please stay with us.